Hey there, once again, welcome back to Drummer Daily. This is it's episode number 199. Not sure if there'll be any notes for today's episode, but every once in a while I like to remind you of what episode this is. Or maybe I'm just reminding myself of the fact that it's how many of these podcast episodes I've done. It's a lot of them. But hey, today we are going to talk about tuning toms. Now that's something that I haven't had a chance to cover a ton on the podcast, but I figured I'm well overdue for talking about that. And so I put together a couple of tips because there are a lot of unique problems that come up with tom tuning. There's for everything from your toms sounding like hitting a trash bag to your tom sounding like a dog barking and everything in between. And without getting into me listing off every single type of problem that you might have and what that specific solution is, I'm going to give you a few tips that will hopefully almost universally work for fixing the problem that you may be encountering, or even if you don't have any problems, just maybe a couple of new things to approach when you're tuning your toms. All right, so I've got 3 tips I'm going to share with you today. Number 1 is this, and by the way, before I get into this, I just want to say I feel like definitely out of all the drums on the kit, so kick drums and snares, and I guess that's really it. But out of all of the different kinds of drums you have on a drum set, I definitely think toms are the hardest. And I'm sure if you've had any experience at all trying to tune drums, you probably feel the same way. But just because they're the hardest doesn't mean objectively that it has to be hard. It's not really, really difficult. It's just it's not as easy as the other drums to tune. So I just want to make sure that you keep that in mind. A lot of times we can amp ourselves up to expect something to be difficult, and then we end up making that turn out to be true because our expectations are this is the hardest thing for me to do. So just want you to kind of a mini tip, tip 0.5 instead of tip number 1 is don't approach it like it's going to be hard, because you can definitely make it harder than it needs to be by having that mindset. All right, so tip number 1 is to start over. If I have a tom that's giving me a lot of trouble, and I know that the reason why is that it's out of tune, and maybe the head's okay, it's just it's not tuned as well as it could be. A lot of times what we can be tempted to do, and this I'm definitely guilty of this, especially like if I'm touring and I have like a house kit that I'm having to play and one tom sounds exceptionally bad. I can be tempted just to go start, cranking on different lugs or tension rods and trying to fix the problem based on what I think the problem is. And a lot of times what I'll end up doing is making the process a little hard or a little worse, making the sound a little worse, or the process a little harder than it needs to be. And so what I've discovered is a better approach most of the time is, especially with the drum that I'm unfamiliar with, is just to start over. The best way to fix a tuning problem with the tom is really just loosen all the tension rods back down to, just before they make contact with the rim, and then kind of reseat them right there where they're touching the rim, which is the process I always teach everyone to follow with tuning drums in general. It's basically kind of like finger tightening, but a little bit more precise. But then I basically just go from there and I pretend that I'm putting the drum head on the drum for the very first time. And that lets you kind of start back from square one. And a lot of times just by doing that and then following what I'm going to mention in my 3rd tip will be enough to really get you, I'd say 90% of the way to something that's awesome. And I definitely think you could probably get 100% of the way to something usable by following this step in the this tip in the 3rd tip I'm going to give you. So tip number 1 is just start over with, get it back to 0 and try again. So tip number 2 is this. Well, if you followed that first tip and your head is sitting completely loose on the drum. So let's say you've started back over from square one. Once you get it there, you might realize, wait a minute, this head is actually in really bad shape. And so tip number 2 is to blame your drum heads. But don't just blame them, fix it. And I don't mean, there's that video that's been going around on social media for a while of a guy like taking a hairdryer or a heat gun to his drum heads to get the wrinkles out. It's like that, yeah, you might have gotten the wrinkles out, but it didn't fix the drum head in the way it sounds. But what I'll do sometimes, and this definitely was the case back when I used to hit a lot harder with the drums, but I would loosen up the head, and then it would look like a satellite dish or a dinner plate. It'd be sunken in the middle, where it had stretched out from all the hard hitting. And a lot of times you don't see that stuff until you loosen the head. And so definitely, if you try to follow my first tip and you get to that point and you realize that that the head is in really bad shape, you should try to change that head. That probably will fix the problems you were having in the first place. But other thing is that I can a lot of times I can start to tell by sound, especially with myself now when I play on my own kit a lot more. I know when a drum head is starting to sound like it's shot and it needs to be replaced. Without even having to like loosen it and look at it. And a lot of times now as well, when I loosen my heads, they don't look dented in like I was talking about, because I just don't hit as hard anymore. But it can be harder to tell if your head's not dented in. So my rule of thumb is this: if I'm thinking that it's a possibility that I need to change a drum head, if I think, man, if I might need to change this drum head, I need to look into it further and figure it out. If I'm in that place and I'm thinking that way, chances are I do need to change that head. So I should just go ahead and plan on changing it. And so that's step number 2, or tip number 2 for tuning toms. And like I mentioned, if you follow those 2 tips, this is probably the tip that's going to help you the most. And this is also, incidentally, where a lot of drummers fail when they tune tom heads. And it's this: stay organized when you're tuning the head. And what do I mean by stay organized? It means that you need to keep track of which tension rods you've tightened and which ones you haven't, and always tighten each tension rod the same amount when you are working your way up from, again, assuming that you started from ground zero, like we talked about in tip number 1, you've loosened the head up all the way. No matter what you do, go ahead and tighten every tension rod the same amount. And what will happen is, for example, I might start by tuning a tom. I might do like a half turn or 1.5 turns each, on each lug or something like that. Just whatever the amount is, make sure that you do it on each one. And as you get the drum up to pitch that you want, make sure you're doing the same amount all across the board, so to speak. The other benefit of that, and here's the thing about that, is that if you have a relatively new drum, and I mean by relatively new, I mean most likely it was built in the last 20 years, and or it wasn't completely neglected and abused, and it's in good shape. Doing just that is probably going to get you pretty darn close to having a good tuned head. I would also do the same exact thing for the bottom head, because the big part of tom sound is the interplay between the 2 heads. So what I would aim for first, and again, this isn't going to work for everybody for every situation, but go ahead and do the same thing on the bottom head you did on the top head, and even down to the number of turns you did on the lugs. And if you do that, the aim would be that you're going to get a top and bottom head that are tuned basically to the same pitch. Now, that might be a little too resonant for some of you, and it definitely is for me. So maybe without getting too much into music theory and things like that, you can tune the bottom head maybe a 1/4 turn or a 1/2 turn higher than the top head. So tune the resonant head a little higher than the batter head, the head that you're striking. And again, this is oversimplifying, but if you're new to tuning or you don't go into in depth with music theory, this can be a good place to start. If you are more into music theory, I normally go somewhere for like a minor third interval. So I want my resonant head to be a minor third higher than the batter head. But either way, do that. And like I said, most of the time, if you just follow these steps, you're going to get 90% of the way towards a sound that you're going to be happy with. You might be really happy with it. But if you don't believe me, just try it out. Try it out next time. Keep it simple and just stay focused and stay organized and see if that helps you out. And again, just to reiterate, we can sometimes kind of psych ourselves up and end up getting a little flustered when we expect something like tuning a drum to be really difficult. And we end up making it more difficult in the process because we're ready. We're on the edge of a frustration before we even start. So approach it from a new perspective. The next time you tune a tom, if you are likely to get frustrated, try to approach it from a new perspective this time and see where that gets you. And let me know where that gets you. Send me an email. Let me know, daniel@danielhadaway.com, and I will love to hear your feedback on tuning this way and how it works for you. All right, thanks for joining me. Now, next episode is episode number 200. I don't have anything, some crazy celebratory episode planned, but I'll do something special in the next few episodes. I've just got too much content that I want to share with you to slow down right now and do a self-congratulating 200 episodes. But I do thank you for joining me, and especially those of you who've been here since the beginning, or even if you're a new listener. I've heard from some of you that you binge listened to all of my episodes, and that means a lot because it means for some reason you have decided to spend a ridiculous amount of time hanging out with me and talking about drums, and that means a ton to me. And I hope you keep doing it because I like having you around as well. So thanks for joining me. Go play some drums, and we'll talk again really soon. Bye for now.